All right. Well, good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining us for our early bird special discussing fall pollinator plants. This presentation will be presented by Senior Wildlife Biologist James Hall. So this is a brief presentation before we kick off our Converting to Wildlife Management presentation at 6 p.m. Because we are so limited on time, we will not be taking questions for this portion, but we will provide James's contact information at the end in case you'd like to submit a follow-up question that way. And now, without further ado, James, feel free to take it away.
Great, thank you, Avalon. I appreciate it. And please, everybody, give props to Avalon. I finished my portion of the presentation just a few minutes before 5 o'clock, so she didn't really get much of a break today. Again, my name is James Hall, like Avalon said, Senior Wildlife Biologist at Plateau, and I just wanted to give kind of a brief rundown of fall pollinator plants. We all kind of generally idea or know what that means and what I'll be talking about, but kind of trying to consolidate that information into what you might see on your property and how that might benefit wildlife, especially pollinators. So just briefly, obviously fall or autumn goes from September 22nd through December 21st. We all get a break from the heat. We get cooler temperatures. But pollinators don't get a break. They need nectar, they need food, and even more impressively, they need to migrate. And so fall is the peak pollinator migration period. And so quickly, who are the pollinators? Generally, everybody knows this, but bees, there are thousands of species of solitary bee species, not just the European bee that we cultivate in hives, but bees, butterflies like the famous monarch butterfly pictured here, moths, wasps, flies, beetles, even bats, and of course birds like the hummingbird, and of course even the wind. So pretty straightforward, but all a very important part of the ecosystem. And here's a glimpse of the monarch migration. So it's a very impressive ordeal. During this period of the fall, monarchs are migrating south to escape the winter, and they migrate thousands of miles. And in that time period, they need nectar, they need food. And along with the monarch, all the other moths and butterflies need that as well. And so most of the wildflowers and flowering trees and shrubs that we think of typically bloom in the spring, but there are a ton of varieties that actually bloom in the fall to propagate this migration and to survive and getting prepared at the end of their life cycle and through the winter. So what are the fall bloomers? Like I said, there's a variety of plants. There's thousands of plants that bloom in late summer through the fall and into early winter. But I just wanted to kind of highlight a few of the common ones that I have a preference for. And these are all going to be generally plants that I see where I do most of my work in Central Texas. I see these kind of on a day-to-day basis. One of my favorites is frostweed. Most people don't know anything about it. It's kind of inconspicuous. It's not showy or colorful, but it's beautiful, tall growing, densely clumped plant. It grows typically in the full shade, oftentimes under live oaks. Very beneficial for butterflies. If you're walking through a clump of these in the fall, you will undoubtedly see a variety of butterflies and bees and moths and other species using them. And a quick note, if I will say about frostweed too, the reason they're called frostweed is in a really hard freeze that we get in the winter, frost sheets of actual ice sheets kind of burst out of the stalk of this plant and create these cool little curls of ice that are really unusual and weird, that you should take a look next time you're out in the freezing cold. So another common one, real kind of similar in growth, but opposite in where they are found, is snow on the prairie. Often also tall growing, They grow spread out instead of dense clumps, often in disturbed pastures that have been heavily grazed in the full sun. And they start blooming in the summer, but they maintain their nectar stores going into early November. And you'll see also in this picture is a variety of plants that are well known, usually broomweed and ragweed. Some of the light green and kind of the tannish brown plants there are also typical in heavily grazed fields, and also not very popular because they tend to be kind of invasive and crowd out a lot of native grasses and stuff like that. But they are very beneficial for pollinators, just in moderation. So here's like an example of the same property, but another one of these pastures that's just kind of completely dominated by ragweed and broomweed. And I completely sneezed myself to death after walking through this field. I'm very allergic, but so obviously native grasses, wildflowers, a mix of prairie plants is more beneficial than a solid field of broomweed, ragweed, stuff like that. A real common one, another real common one in the hill country, central Texas, is verbena. And I believe this is prairie verbena. This was pictured on a friend of mine's property in Dripping Springs. This picture was taken in mid-November. And so usually by mid-November, a lot of mostly spring blooming wildflowers have stopped showing up and stopped showing off their beautiful flowers. But verbena seems to be one of those lingering plants, especially in a wet year like we had this year. They tend to kind of stick around and do really well in the fall as well, or in addition. So just a good example of prairie verbena, excuse me, grows in open, sunny fields and pastures and stuff like that. Straggler daisy. Kind of a weedy, junky plant that a lot of people have. You may be familiar with it if you have a shady backyard or front yard and you don't have a lot of grass. This was taken in my backyard, where I have lots of a big lacking of lawn grass in some areas. But it's a low growing, really beneficial forb, kind of like a weed, but low growing, likes full shade. They have really tiny yellow flowers you can see there. And this picture was taken today in my backyard. And you can see those tiny little flowers just starting to pop out. I don't even know how big they are, just very minuscule. And also too, one of the benefits of straggler daisy is it's a good alternative for green backyards, or getting yard space where lawn grass is not something you're going after. Much more beneficial. It's a good alternative for low growing green cover to benefit wildlife rather than kind of the lawn look. And I'm a wildlife biologist, so I wanted straggler daisy in my backyard, but also I'm very lazy and I can't keep up with the yard. So it's kind of like it's kind of like a vicious cycle there. And so that's what we have. Goldenrod. This was not taken in my yard, but this just a gorgeous fall blooming plant. It's tall, it's showy with these big bright yellow blooms. Typically you'll find these kind of in moist soils, usually in sun or part shade. I've actually seen these in full dense shade on the edges of creeks and things like that, under like juniper woodland canopy. So I think they're more variable than what you'll probably read in the literature, and it may depend on the species that you're looking at, but just a very attractive plant. Obvious the benefits for wildlife just by looking at it. Another real common fall bloomer is the Maximillian sunflower. And this is a native sunflower species that tends to bloom a little bit later than most people know of the common sunflower, the ones that people are planting, large food plots for dove hunting and things like that. This is a variety of that or another species of that, equally tall, spectacular in the sun, and just really beneficial for a variety of species. And of course, once the flowers kind of start dying off and the heads of those sunflowers start putting out their seeds, then the goldfinches and the house finches and all these other small songbirds come in and use it. So in pollinators in general, it's just very beneficial for wildlife, and of course very attractive as well. Purple aster, it's just a beautiful plant. This is a little bit of an earlier bloomer, probably by the time that we get into fall and peak migration, these have started to slow down on their blooming, but still beneficial because the migration doesn't start when fall starts. It starts kind of usually starts in August. You'll start seeing a lot of butterfly movement. Same time the songbirds start migrating as well, and the hummingbirds start coming in and things like that. Very showy, and so probably by the time the peak migration occurs, this one has fizzled out, but just definitely worth demonstrating. And there's a ton of aster species. There's fall aster, and there's a variety of plants that I couldn't take the time to list them all, but really in general, that group of sunflowers and asters have a variety of species that can be planted or show up naturally in a natural environment, and very beneficial for wildlife, as I said. So there's also shrubs and trees and other plants that are good for pollinators. And kidneywood is one of my favorites. And this is kind of not a well-known shrub. It's not a name that you hear on an everyday basis like you hear persimmon or mesquite or juniper. But kidneywood is one of my favorite native hill country shrubs. It blooms around now, late summer through the fall, with very, very small, relatively small, inconspicuous white flowers. And it looks a lot like, some people are familiar with bee bush or white brush. More common a little bit towards the western end of the Edwards Plateau. Real common in like Llano and Burnett counties and places like that where there's real gravelly, well-drained soils. But if you walk by these shrubs this time of the year, they'll literally be humming with the sounds of bees. I mean, they're just covered right now. And so obvious benefits there. Real dense growing. The only issue with this plant, I would say probably, is that it's very highly palatable to white-tailed deer. So in other words, if you live in Central Texas, for example, in the hill country or the Edwards Plateau, there's a lot of deer in the area, and you may never see this plant. And there's some properties I go to that I'm looking for this specifically to give me an indication of whether or not you have a ton of deer. Unfortunately, a lot of people have a ton of deer. They're everywhere. And so kidneywood can be kind of few and far between. Unlike bee bush or white brush, which looks very similar, and I don't have a picture of it, but that's not edible by deer. They don't go after it very much. And so those grow in really thick clumps and can kind of even take over. But I urge landowners all the time, if you have big clumps of this stuff, usually the mentality is to get rid of as much as you can. I always tend to say, look, just leave this clump over here, get rid of it all over here, but on the right side of the road, get rid of as much as you'd like. That way we balance it out, and you've got cover for wildlife, and you've got pollinator habitat and nectar come fall. So all sorts of things going on in a complicated ecosystem, but kidneywood happens to be one of my favorites. And I'm really rolling through this quickly, so we'll figure out a way to make up that time. But this is American beautyberry. Technically not really a fall bloomer. There's not a flower associated with this plant in the fall, But as you can see from this picture, it's very attractive. And it's a deciduous shrub, meaning it loses its leaves every year and comes back in the spring brilliantly. But this time of the year, as you start getting into these cooler temperatures in the fall, we have these just magnificent small magenta colored fruits that grow in these tight little clusters on the stem. And so again, technically not a fall bloomer, but lots of benefit to small mammals, songbirds, deer. And I had to show this one. I mean, I can't help it. In the fall, this time of the year, things start changing color. In some parts of Texas, things have this in between period where it's real drab because of the heat of the summer and everything's kind of sagging before the fall color comes. Beautyberry is something that just pops, and you'll find these usually in mostly shade, oftentimes near creeks and drainages in the Edwards Plateau, and more frequently, more spread out, east of I-35 in the woods and stuff like that. And literally that was supposed to be drawn out a little bit longer, but it's a pretty straightforward idea. The numerous pollinator species that use either migrating or not that require food this time of the year in preparation for the winter at the end of their life cycle. It's just critical. And a lot of these plants are not very showy. They're not very beautiful. Some of them are, but it's an overlooked aspect of part of the ecosystem and part of native habitat here in Texas. So I was excited that this was one of the topics selected for this program because it's a cool feature, and I will very much look forward to talking about this more. If y'all want to reach out to me, there's my email address. And again, my name is James Hall. Avalon, sorry I couldn't keep going with it, but but actually I think it's good timing. So
that's perfect. Thank you so much, James. Lots of great information. And if anybody does have any questions about our early bird special, I will take this contact information and pop it in the chat section so you can copy it and save it to your computer as we move into the next section. But thank you again, James.
Thank you. Thank you all.